Good morning. Not bad. We'll try it one more time. Good morning. There we go. If we could load the slides, please. Or is that my job? There we go. So I'm very pleased to be able to have the opportunity and the honor to talk to you today. And I've titled this, Creating a National Innovation Ecosystem. This is one, let's see. This is one where I'm going to start off, having been an educator for a while. I'm going to ask a question. And I'm going to also ask you to think about this as you go through today. What do you feel is the key to innovation? So think what would be the number one aspect that would change the nation's innovation culture. And to do that, I'm going to start off by asking and answering, at least, what is innovation? So the design, the invention, development, implementation of new products, services, processes, systems, organizational structure, business models. So this is big for the purpose of creating value. And of course, what's value? This is one definition. But there's another definition that I enjoy. This one comes from Steve Blank, who I've had the honor and the pleasure to work with pretty closely. And this one is satisfying users' current or future needs or wants by turning an idea into a product or service with speed and urgency using minimal resources and costs. I like this one, because you're trying to be able to do something in a timely fashion, and you're trying to do something at the least amount of cost. And we're not just talking about financial, we're talking about time. So, second part of what I asked you was the innovation ecosystem. So what is one? So I happen to like this graphic, which I know you can't read, but I'm going to just sort of generally do some broad brushstrokes around it. And this is a graphic that shows, for example, some of the energy that needs to go into the system to be able to get the system started. And in this case, what actually starts the system is at the bottom left of the screen, where there's ideas being generated. These are coming from national labs, they're coming from academic institutions, they're coming from, for example, some of the science centers where you have K through 12 outreach activities. But what any ecosystem is going to need is people, resources, processes, and time. And that's what this graphic, I think, does a good job of depicting. And if people are interested, I'm certainly more than willing to share all these slides so you'll be able to grab these. But what's interesting about this one is that it shows the need for having a seed mechanism to be able to start things growing, to be able to start the ecosystem in operation. And so the question is, how do we actually start the ecosystem growing? How can we do this? And hence, National Science Foundation. It provides a lot of the seed to be able to start the ecosystem going. It provides university research that's driven by typically industrial needs. It involves supporting of faculty and students to be able to actually build the people. And it focuses on translational research, easing the technology's handoff from the university environment into the industrial environment. Furthermore, it actually offers some embedded processes. We have the process of educating students, having them participate with researchers that have already gone through their own educational system, and that process of being able to enhance learning is built into it. We do this with seed dollars of about $7.3 billion. This is the 15 National Science Foundation budget. You can see that this is, I'm here to tell you, as a government employee, thank you, because you're the ones who are providing us with all of this funding to be able to do it. But here's the good news, that the trend, as you can look at this chart, is going up, isn't it? That's a good thing because what we're funding is the future. And the type of funding that we provide offers translational research that's actually supported through a variety of different programs. We start off at the basic science and technology centers. We have programs in engineering research centers, and that's in the division that I'm currently the deputy of. So this is one where it's actually sort of the holy grail of engineering funding because it's 10 years of support from the National Science Foundation. That's good if you can get it because it allows you to be able to create activities that will actually be able to be supported from year to year from, in many ways, different communities of practice. In addition, it has involvement in terms of industrial and university cooperative arrangements to be able to do research, and small business innovative research, which is meant to be able to actually take an idea from the initial seed to a product development. To be able to give you some sort of depiction of this in terms of the timeline, you can see that we have heavy activities around the early stages, the research and discovery stages, proof of concept, the point where we build early stage prototypes. So the types of fundings that you see here, the STC, the ERC, the SBIR, are really more towards the left side of this graph. Towards the right side, we start pushing out where we need more funding to be able to provide the financial resources to actually go into manufacturing and distribution into an industrial environment. Associated with this are a couple of examples. Let me just offer. So one of the first in 1991 was one of the first STCs around, and it was established at University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana. And this was the place that was actually the development site for magnetic resonant imaging. In terms of engineering research center funding, this is one that often chokes me up because what this did is it actually built an artificial retina so that somebody who was blind from birth can see. That's pretty amazing. This was an activity that was funded by the SBIR, the Small Business Innovative Research Program, that started with a $265,000 grant that led to a company called Qualcomm, which is now a $78 billion company and has more than 10,000 patents that are being licensed out to a variety of different companies. And of course, not to be forgotten is one tiny little company, Google, that was funded under our size and engineering directorates to be able to actually look at different types of technologies. And by the way, the Google car that you hear so much about was one of the original ideas that they had and were pursuing before their faculty members said, you know, I don't think that's really ready for prime time. You might want to look at search engines. Anyway, all right, so in 2011, so that's sort of the background. In 2011, even before the recession, entrepreneurship in the States was declining. So we had a smaller share of U.S. companies that were being formed. There was a share of the labor force in the new companies was actually dropping as well. The startup rate was falling, and the share of venture capital going to small companies was going down as well. And then the last, about 40% more of it was going to one part of the nation, and that was Silicon Valley. So we needed to do something to be able to fix this. And as we look at the science and engineering indicators, and by the way, NSF, if you don't know, has a science and engineering indicators site that allows you to be able to download all sorts of information, the graphics, the statistics associated with policy decisions and such, and that's where this is coming from. But you can see there was a steady decline from 1996 to 2011 in R&D expenditures across the nation. And same thing in Japan and the EU. However, China, notice, is on a different slope. They're positive, we're negative. In addition, when you look through the number of researchers, and this is fairly significant to me because I do believe that people drive systems and not the other way around, unless it's a car. But when we look at this, you'll see that China is actually increasing in the number of researchers. And yet the US is basically stagnant at this point. So one day in May, this was back in 2011, there was a note that was offered that Dr. Suresh would like to meet with us. So myself and Errol Arklish, who was at the foundation. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Subra Suresh was the former director of NSF. He's now the president of Carnegie Mellon University. He came from MIT, and he started the Deshpande Center, which was an incubator at MIT. And he wanted to be able to talk with us. And what he had asked for was a new startup. Now, of course, the point at that time was one where you saw these declining trends that we needed to be able to deal with. And what he wanted to be able to do was focused on, how many of you know what the Valley of Death is? Okay, for those of you who don't, it's the center that you see in this figure between the development side and actually moving towards commercialization. And the valley is one in which it's difficult to be able to get from that development into commercialization. But before that valley is something we refer to as the ditch of death. And that little ditch is the point where you're going from the initial discovery to being able to understand what's the value proposition of that discovery. And what is, for example, the customer for that discovery. So we were focused around trying to be able to do something in this space. And in particular, we were looking at how we might be able to engage the different aspects of what exists at a university other than what we've currently being used, which is typically, for example, technology transfer offices that didn't have a strong relationship with the faculty or the student populations. And so we asked the question, what can help us bridge this gap? Or how can we get across the ditch? And we looked around. So we basically spent about a month, and those of you who don't know Dr. Suresh, he's an engineer. So engineers don't like to sit still very long. And he really tasked us with being able to develop a program within the next 6 months. At NSF, programs typically take about 2 years to be able to start. So that's sort of the frame of reference. So we went and looked around at all of the different opportunities that we had across the states. And we came upon one called E245, which was a course that was being taught at Stanford University by this serial entrepreneur, somebody who's failed miserably but had some huge successes. His name was Steve Blank. Those of you who don't know, he's got a blog. He's now actually pretty popular in the lean launchpad space because he started it. And he had an agile process. And so we called him up. And in fact, Errol made the call and said, "Hey, Steve, your government needs you." Steve's reply was, "I already served in the military. You don't need me anymore." Okay, well, he loves to tell that story. The truth is that he was driving, he pulled over, and he said, "Wow, this is actually a very different opportunity." And what we developed at that point was something called Ichor. Now, there's a lot of lore about where this came from, but I'll be honest, it was really a series of discussions that took place between Steve and Errol and myself and a variety of other folks at NSF where we were looking at how would we create an environment and change the culture at a university by being able to engage more than just an individual faculty member and be able to provide the resource and the guidance that would be able to enhance the faculty members' interest in being able to explore an innovative opportunity. So what we looked at was trying to move from what business schools typically were focused on for innovation, which is let's figure out what the customers are and then quickly move to execution. How do you actually then build create the customers and actually build the company? Well, we weren't interested in execution so much as understanding what's associated with getting over the ditch. And at this point, the brilliance that we found in Steve Blank's activity was integrating the scientific method. How many of you remember the scientific method from 6th grade, I think, 7th grade? This is where you're actually taking the opportunity to start with a hypothesis. What if such and such? What would happen? Actually go through and design an experiment to be able to see what the outcomes are, test it, and then actually get the insight from the results of what goes on and continue along this loop by iterating in multiple cycles. This is the scientific method. What he was doing in his class was actually having the students go through this discovery, but not at the academic environment. Getting out of the classroom, getting out of the university, and going to the community and asking the questions of, what would you want? And instead of trying to sell their product, learn what is the value proposition of that product. And so this was coupled with something called the business model canvas. This is a one-page document. How many of you take notes? And how many of you then distill your notes when you're done to a single-page document that you can actually remember? Very few of us do that. This is the true value of this business model canvas. It's a one-page document, but it actually is a very strategic document. There's 9 boxes associated with it. You'll notice they have different sizes, different orientation. But when you go through this scientific method of going through the hypothesis testing and get the insight, this is the one-page document in which you place your information. And there's a relationship between the different boxes that you have. For example, what is the value proposition? What is the customer segment? What are the customer relationships? What are the revenue streams that you need? What is the cost structure of the opportunity? And it's the integration of this knowledge that allows you to be able to better understand what to do. And it was the first time that we were actually training our faculty to be able to take advantage of this. Further, in the past, we had a problem at NSF, and that was we had centers that we funded. They were disparate centers. They didn't really work together in any cohesive manner. They all thought their culture was different. They all had their own commercialization programs. There was no sharing of best practices. There wasn't really a common training or education or a common platform. And they all had hard technology focuses without really understanding what the user inspiration would be. And we didn't really have a centralized leadership. So we had goals for this program where we were going to leverage the NSF investments. So we went back to Suresh and we said, you know what? There's about, at any given time, about 50,000 active NSF awards. People that are receiving funding from NSF, about 50,000. If we could tap just a small percentage of those, a small percentage, even, let's say 5%, and turn those from an idea into an actual commercialization effort, we're going to have a huge influence over the nation's well-being. And so that's what we did. We looked at being able to tap the internal war chest, if you will, of NSF to be able to actually bring those things across the ditch. And we came up with a program that had, in essence, training of a team. This came about because I had taught a multimedia programming course in Finland over the summer. Did it in 3 weeks. I had teams of 3 work together, and they worked pretty much all day long on projects. And then they would go out and they would show their projects and get feedback. So it was a little bit like what Steve Blank did, but what we decided was we're going to use a very short period of time. Relatively speaking, across that ecosystem that I showed you, which spanned about 9 years, this was going to be 7 weeks. So we were going to put people through an intensive 7-week activity. They start off with a 3-day workshop. There'll be follow-up virtual meetings for 5 weeks, and then we'll end up with a lessons learned activity. And then they'd actually go through a process where at the end, they'd make a go or no-go decision. And what's the beauty of this? We tell people, those of you who've participated, please tell me if I'm wrong, because if I am, I need to change something. But we celebrate the no-goes as much as we do the goes. Why? We want to save the intellectual resource of this nation, and if it's not going to pan out, let's give them the opportunity to do something else. Let's move that intellectual resource onto a project that has better results. So when we look at this, here's the type of results that we found. This was before the knowledge that they had associated with the different aspects of what it takes to be able to move to commercialization before. Here's what happened after. So it was totally shifted from the left to the right. Left is little knowledge, right is lots of knowledge. Same thing, we did it in 2012 with another cohort. Here's the left, there's the right. And this is across multiple dimensions of what's involved in learning to go through that pathway. Now the question was, how do we actually scale this? So we did 2 cohorts. One was in Stanford, one ended up in DC area. We did 2 cohorts, but the problem was, how do we take, for example, Steve Blank, and then put him around the US? And that's where we came up with the concept of, instead of having centers, let's create nodes. And the terminology was very specific here, because I was trying to send the message of, we're not going to create silos where the knowledge resides, but we're going to create nodes that operate together on a network. And so from the beginning, from the get-go, we were trying to be able to develop a network of folks that had experience in the area, that had passion for the area, to work together to be able to actually build a change in culture across the nation. That was nothing short of changing the culture of trying to be able to do development across the nation. We then produced this network, so the 7 nodes that we fund currently are connected by different means. And as an example, the trainers who offer the training for the cohorts can come from any one of those 7 nodes. It's typically a team of 3 to 6 educators who are working with the group, giving their guidance, many of which have been serial entrepreneurs. But they may come from totally different parts of the country. We bring them together as one unified team to be able to teach it. In addition, what we found was we wanted to be able to further create a culture in other institutions than just the 7 of the nodes that we had on the network. And so we came across the concept, and this is Anita LaSalle's concept and brilliance, to be able to do sites. Sites are, we give an institution about $100K, and what they do per year, what they do is they foster team development in their local institution. So, for example, student projects, student ideas, trying to be able to get activities into the freshman year of a student's career path, to be able to inculcate them early on to be able to think differently, think a bit out of the box, and if these ideas come forward, then they could actually build together a team that then goes into the national cohort and goes through the national training. I haven't mentioned it, but these teams that I'm talking about include a group of 3 people participating, one of which is oftentimes a student And here's the thing, that we have a student entrepreneurial lead, we have the principal investigator, who's typically a faculty member, but we couple those two with an industrial mentor, somebody who's been there and done that to be able to help guide it. Who gets to talk? Who doesn't get to talk? The faculty. And that is a change in culture. In fact, we don't allow them to present. We have the entrepreneurial lead. And that's by design, by the way, because we're trying to be able to build the future of our ability to be able to actually put out personnel into the world that actually have this type of experience, who are the leaders of tomorrow. So we're trying to be able to build teams at these sites from the student base and then be able to put them into the national cohort. Well, it's funny, it's now 4 years later. We've had more than 600 national teams. So that's 600 times 3, 1,800 people that we've influenced by this program. There's been approximately 580 industrial mentors who have participated. There have been 30 cohorts. Cohort is about 21 to 24, 25 teams. There's 36 sites in operation right now. There's 7 nodes that are in operation. And we have organizations that now have actually gotten on the bandwagon with NSF. I forged a relationship with the National Institute of Health, and they are now running Ichor for our health sciences. We have the energy, we have the, believe it or not, National Security Agency is participating in this, trying to be able to build innovation in the protection of our IT infrastructure. And we have the Gates Foundation and the Department of Human Services. We also ran an Ichor not for innovation of technology, but how do you change education? And we call it Ichor for Learning as well. This gives you a sense of the different teams that we have. They're pretty much geographically distributed. And I'm just going to sort of cut to the chase here. We ended up with about $24 million of capital that's been produced by these teams as of February of this year. So it's been a rather large success, I think it's safe to say. So why does this work? First thing is, it's only $50K, but $50,000 on an NSF grant isn't that much, actually, but it's enough. Why? Because it causes the administrators to sit up and take notice, because it is an NSF grant. It's also pretty selective. So even though it's $50K, we're trying to get a lot of folks in. There's a rather rigorous interviewing process that you have to go through to be able to be selected as a team. There's cachet associated with this program. It seems like everyone says, oh yeah, I've been in Ichor. Okay, well that's great, because we're trying to be able to infuse the culture. We have a deep commitment of NSF program officers. Anita LaSalle, Babu Dasgupta, some of you may know, myself, Errol. We used to go every time to each one of these cohorts. Babu still does, and we participate with the cohorts for the full 7 weeks. You also have learning in a context that has sense and meaning. Let me say that again. You're learning in a context that has sense and meaning. Because you're going out and doing the interviewing, you're actually producing the opportunity to move things from your working memory into your long-term memory. Because of the interviews you have, the conversations you have, there's greater relevance to the knowledge that you're garnering as you go through this scientific process. And again, we celebrate the no-go. Again, this is meant for you at least to get a sense of the process that we have in the Ichor ecosystem. And again, it's very much in the way of a process that we use to be able to bring teams together, be able to train them, and then be able to provide them with some of the resources to go out and be successful. Look at some of the examples that we have. In our first cohort, we had a company that was trying to be formed called Anchovy Labs. They developed software to be able to actually annotate a large number of images almost instantaneously. So it would go through, rip through a folder and be able to annotate each one of the images as to what's in the image. Well, it was only 6 months later they were acquired by Dropbox. There was an activity, this one I love, it's called Math Snacks. And they're basically small little pieces of teaching K through 12 math, such as algebra or what have you. Who do you think they felt was going to be their customer? Anyone? School districts, teachers. Well, they went through, they did 100 customer interviews. What do you think they found? I'm going to tell you. Grandparents. Sure enough, around the holiday season, what did they do? They bought their grandchildren, math snacks. They wouldn't have found that, by the way, had they not gone through the program. This one we refer to as pig poop. It's basically turning manure into material that allows you to be able to provide liquid asphalt, so be able to create new roadways. And no, it doesn't stink. This was another one that pivoted. This was a robot to be able to do security, be able to do inspection of cracks on a building, and they moved to a pivot of being able to do window washing. This was a company, she was also in our first cohort, to be able to actually use cognitive psychology to predict what images people were putting into their minds. What did they actually have as an image? And it's now predicting what you would put on a website to be able to attract people's attention. I'll just go through one more. And this is a project that was done at a site where actually there's software that will register hand signals and be able to do sign language, translate sign language into text on the screen instantaneously using a tablet. Pretty cool stuff. We have an evaluation process where we're looking from year 1 to year 6. We've actually run through 4 years, and we're actually looking at what has come. But I'll just offer some comments. There's been a huge influence on the research of the PIs. There's been an encouragement of PIs to be able to work on problems that people really care about. This is interesting from the standpoint of a researcher who spent their life in a laboratory. The influence on teaching is that faculty are now actually going out and encouraging scientists to be able to pursue different types of vantage points with the knowledge they're trying to impart. And this came from an EL, an entrepreneurial lead, that it was a life-changing experience for their career. They now recognize that their motivation that they have is to be able to push them a lot harder because the world is an oyster sort of thing. There's an infinite amount of information. You just need to be able to go after it. This one we really love, and that is it completely changed the way our technology transfer office and incubator mentors people. So let me just go back to the question and say, what's the key to innovation? And here I'm going to offer, we need to make some changes. And K through 12, if you think about it, your program from the beginning in the U.S. K through 12 system to start with some input, come up with a system, and offer a solution or, in essence, an answer. This is the process that we follow. However, in your career, you're typically given some input and some desired output that you want to be able to produce, and you're supposed to be able to come up with the system in the middle that gets from there to there. This is contrary to the way we actually trained. And in fact, there's a dichotomy because schools almost want to be able to have a single discipline with only one answer, yet in the workplace, there's really no right answer. It's just a matter of which one is going to be the best. When you look at industry's wishes, their number one interest in being able to hire people is to be able to find those who can identify problems. What does academia feel is the most important thing? Having students solve problems. There's, again, a disconnect that we need to solve. We currently have an environment where we need T-shaped scientists, artists, engineers, what have you, to be able to look at those who have both breadth and depth. So we need to change the educational system to be able to stimulate and encourage and foster creativity and innovation. This is an active role for institutes of higher education because we want to be able to have them foster this tinkering spirit. How many of you know what the picture is? I guess I'm the oldest person in the room. Okay. This is an erector set, and it was my toy. This is what I lived on. In fact, this was the erector set I had. We want students to be able to identify problems, use Lego is today's world of erector sets, to be able to actually come up with solutions, and we want them to be able to develop and test hypotheses with the right tools. We want you to seek feedback and iterate often. This is what we found to be successful, not just in Ichor, but all of NSF programs. I had the fortune of being able to teach for 27 years. Students came into my classroom in the early 2000 era, and they hadn't ever, I taught electrical engineering, they hadn't even seen a scope, a multimeter, they hadn't played with things. So I had to change that. I came up with this concept of the mobile studio, and again, much of what I've just shared with you, I wish I had been able to have the luxury of going through. This is now produced by National Instruments. It's produced by Digilent. It's a product that actually puts a whole bunch of laboratory instrumentation, oscilloscopes, and function generators, power supplies, all in what you can see held in an individual's hand. The individual is a student that I worked with in a team environment to be able to build it. So the role of SEC, I couldn't leave without offering this, is to be able to create environments that reward creativity and really nurture innovation. We want you to be able to provide the types of facilities where people come in and play. Some, maker spaces, 3D printers, they're all great, but you want to be able to have an ethos that actually fosters that creative process. Want to be able to encourage faculty to perform use-inspired research rather than just basic research without, in essence, the use. I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing basic research. Please don't misunderstand me, but I think we need to also consider the emphasis. And we want to be able to work with K through 12 environments. Furthermore, we need to engage more into this world. And that means, in particular, when you look at the total graduate enrollment in the States, the number of women that are enrolled in engineering, as one example in comparison to men, there's 31 women for every 100 males. That's a problem because we're missing almost 50% of the population. Furthermore, we need to embrace diversity and we need to engage it as a strategic alternative as we go forward in the future. So with that, I'm going to close with the following. The advances that we have today in science and engineering, they're encompassing all of our lives. I think you can all appreciate this, from the iPhones in your pockets to the technology I'm using to be able to actually offer this message. We have raw materials, innovations, and of course what's really being modified, but not really, is education. And we need to be able to take a new look on the educational ecosystem. We need to be innovative in the ecosystem. And our knowledge is going to fuel the advances that empower our dreams. So we have to do our best to be able to pick what are the right problems that we want to be able to solve and identify them early. And so, as I'll say, I want to leave you with this message. You all can change the world, and please do so one life at a time, which is what I did with my students. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. Yes.
So how do we change education? Because I agree with you completely. Education is not teaching students how to be creative. I was in a
I was appointed to a task force at my university on, what are the barriers to innovation at this university. And after being on that task force for a short period of time, I confided in friends, the barriers to innovation are sitting around the table. So how do we convince those who control education to change it?
Yep. So I have one, what might seem to be flip response, but it's not meant that way. Ichor. And here's what I want them to do. And in fact, I've even proposed this within the Directorate of Engineering at NSF, is that we want to go through Ichor for ourselves. But we need to be able to look at our customers. And so K through 12 or institutes of higher learning need to be able to actually go out and do 100 customer interviews. Who's your customer? If it's the student population, you need to understand the change in that student demographic that's occurred specifically over the last 10 years. The millennial generation is very different than what we had in my classroom 10 years ago, for example. But I would put together teams of administrators, faculty, and students and form Ichor teams that actually look at the innovation environment and think about now not just education as a serial process, but as a set of parallel processes with lots of inputs and outputs, and be able to go through iteration of the process that we go through Ichor, devote 7 weeks to doing the customer interviewing, and be relentlessly direct, as our faculty in Ichor are, the trainers are, in being able to evaluate, wait a second, and call you BS when it's actually BS. And I think you'll see that by having that knowledge, they may change their opinion in terms of what the boxes actually are that constrain the system.
Can you hear me? Okay. So to follow up on that question, Ichor can work to generate areas for fostering tinkering, as you would say, as opposed to the end product becoming a product that goes out to industry that is, mass-produced or bought or something?
Or nobody wants, yep.
Okay, cool, thanks.
And again, I'm not saying Ichor is the panacea for everything. What we want to do is change the mindset. We want to change the culture, where instead of the culture being you have to go through a whole rigmarole to be able to come up with a solution, you want to be able to understand, what are you going to do with that solution? How is this going to actually be meaningful in terms of your own life and others' lives?
Hello, I'm Rhonda Reer from the University of Tennessee, and I had the great honor of going to one of the Ichor sessions that Georgia Tech did, and it was really fabulous. I encourage everyone to do that. My question has to do about culture change in universities, and as you know, it's not the easiest thing to do, is to change a culture in a university. And one of the things that I've run into in my own research is the belief that the United States has the world's greatest higher education system in the world. So why do we want to tinker with that and change our engineering schools, change our universities? And what's your answer to that?
So I'm not going to disagree, because I believe in what we have. I've been lucky enough to participate in what we have. So I don't know that we need to be able to do a wholesale change. I think what we need to be able to do is basically tinker around the edges to be able to make improvements. And I think we need to be able to inculcate the institutional systems with a continuous improvement mentality, as opposed to just throwing everything out and starting over. That's not what we should do. We should try and be able to analyze where we are and how do we do something better. And so now I'm going to give you my I have a dream speech. My I have a dream speech is I want to empower the individual. I want to be able to have the students be able to be empowered to be able to seek whatever knowledge they want without having to be constrained, for example, by a class or a degree program. And so we want the environments to be not changed, but improved to the point that they foster that kind of spirit. I hope that helps.